My name is Lou Brown, and I'm Director of Programs for the Forum for Scholars and Publics here at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Forum at FHI for short. I welcome you today to the celebration of the publication of Professor Ryan Emanuel's book, On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice. It's an honor to host this conversation and to host all of you who've come to join us today. I know some of you traveled a little bit, and we appreciate those of you who are online too. We know that you're out there, and we're sorry that we're not able to interact with you more, but we really appreciate your presence in spirit and in mind. I don't want to take too much time here, but I do have a few things that I need to do before we get started. First, I want to thank all the people at FHI who helped make this event possible, from making sure the doors were unlocked, to setting up the tables and chairs and testing the tech. It always takes a team to make anything happen, and we have a great team that gets it done here. Thanks to Laura from the Gothic Bookshop here at Duke for helping out with book sales, and to her team and the wonderful team at Saladalia who's provided our food tonight. Also thanks to Allison Vick, owner of Little Blue Macaron, and also a member of the Lumbee tribe, who provided the special macarons for today's event. And most of all, thanks to Ryan, who wrote the book. Ryan's been a wonderful partner in creating this event today. I mean, truly, there are people who are hard to work with and people who are easy to work with. And the hardest thing about working with Ryan is that he wants to do some things himself. And that's a luxury to have. A note about how things are going to proceed today. Ryan and Diego will talk for about 40 minutes between the two of them, and then we'll open it up to our in-person audience for questions for about 20 minutes. For those of you at home on Zoom, we do regret that we don't have the capacity to field questions from you, but we do very much appreciate you joining us. If you have any technical difficulties during the discussion, please send a message through the chat and we'll do our best to address your issues. Everyone here with us at FHI is invited to join us after the program for a reception just outside our space here, and Ryan will be available to sign books and chat one-on-one. Does that sound good? All right, so I'm going to make some introductions now. Our guest of honor is Ryan Emanuel. He's a hydrologist and community engaged scholar from North Carolina. He's currently an associate professor of hydrology at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Before arriving at Duke in 2022 as a professor, he worked for nearly 15 years as a faculty member in the University of North Carolina system, first at Appalachian State University and later at North Carolina State. At Duke, his research group studies the impacts of climate change, pollution, and unsustainable development on water and watery places. His group also partners with Native American tribes and other communities to understand environmental change through the lenses of environmental justice and Indigenous rights. Professor Emanuel's work ultimately aims to amplify voices of Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups in areas of environmental science and policy. He belongs to the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. Now, managing our conversation, or being in conversation with Ryan today, is Professor Diego Riveros-Iregui. He's the Bowman and Gordon Gray Professor of Geography and the Environment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research group investigates eco-hydrology, forest and soil processes, and landscape responses to environmental change. He's worked in watersheds across the US and Latin America, including conifer forests of the Rocky Mountains, prairies, temperate forests, urban watersheds, volcanic islands, tropical highland forests, and tropical alpine grasslands. Riveros-Iregui holds a BS in geology from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, an MS in hydrogeology from the University of Minnesota, and a PhD in watershed hydrology from Montana State University. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder and an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska prior to moving to UNC-Chapel Hill in 2013. He's recipient of the J. Carlisle Sitterson Award for teaching first-year students, the National Science Foundation Career Award, a Fulbright Scholar Award, and UNC's Faculty Award for Global Excellence. Now I'll turn it over to the two of them, and they will be your hosts for a while. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you all for coming out. It really is an honor just to be here with all of you and folks online as well. Especially grateful to my family, Casey and Laurel and Reed and mom and dad. And also to folks from UNC Press, Lucas and Peter, thank you so much for all of your help bringing this book to life. And everybody else out there, well, I'm grateful to each of you. So thank you all for being here.
Great. Okay, let's talk about On the Swamp. Why On the Swamp?
Yeah, good question. So I called the book On the Swamp. And what does that mean? That's a colloquialism in the Lumbee community. And it just means in the neighborhood. And, throughout this book, a recurring theme that hit me and that I wanted to share and draw out was the importance of being present, of being in the neighborhood and being on the swamp. And so various times during the book, you will encounter me or other people in the community, in the neighborhood, and on the swamp. And I couldn't think of a better phrase that captures the importance of being present and being part of a community.
Okay, great. In our line of work, writing a book is not uncommon, but it's not super common either. So when did you decide to write a book, and when did you decide that it had to be this book?
Yeah, first I was first of all, I do not come from a book writing discipline at all. I probably know 4 people who had written a book in environmental sciences, and I just didn't have a good model for that, or maybe I just didn't seek out the right people. So, I was kind of lost. But I will tell you, a long time ago, I had this vision. I said, I want to write a book. And I kind of put the cart before the horse because I didn't know what it was going to be about. I just want to be one of those professors who've written a book. And so eventually it turned into an idea about maybe, for lack of a better phrase, a feel-good book about my community and our connections to the places that we come from. And I thought it was important to share that message and to figure out a way to express my love for the land, for Eastern North Carolina, for Robeson County in words. And that was the initial spark for the book. But along the way, as I thought about how much I love the land and the water and our communities, I recognized that there were so many troubling things that were happening. Whether it's the examples that I talk about in the book or other things, it was really hard to tell a feel-good story without unpacking some of these difficult realities around pollution and other things that ultimately link back to colonialism. And so I decided at that point that the book really needed to wrestle with these issues. And other people have wrestled with these before, right? This is a rich area of research and scholarship, but not necessarily for places like North Carolina. I wanted to unpack these stories and to tell them in a way that highlighted our stories and the places that we love and the places that we come from. And so I felt really strongly that the book had to balance both of those things. I still wanted to articulate how important it was to express my love for Robeson County and for other places. But I didn't want to hold back from talking about these really difficult issues. That was just an idea for a long time, but I have to thank Melinda Maynor Lowry for recommending me to a group of ethno-historians almost 10 years ago. They invited me to give a talk at an ethnohistory conference, and I did not know what I was doing, didn't know what this discipline was at all. And I got an invitation, said, do you want to present a conference paper? I said, yes, sure. So in our field, presenting a conference paper means putting 15 slides together and winging it. So you stand in front of the group, you click through the slides, you point at your data, and you're done. And so 3 weeks before this conference, I get an email and it says, just a reminder, your papers are due in 2 weeks. I thought, what is this? And that's when I realized that the origin of this phrase conference paper comes from disciplines where you literally write a paper for the conference and you read it verbatim. And so I intuited this from the email, and I had to quickly write a paper for this conference. And because of the time pressure, I ended up writing it not as a scholarly paper, but in a conversational style, because I knew that I had to write it quickly, and that I also had to write it in a conversational way, since I was going to have to read it out loud. And the last thing I wanted to do was I didn't want to read the kind of journal article that I wrote. And so I wrote it, I submitted it, I read this paper at a conference, and I was walking out of the room afterwards, and a guy grabs me by the elbow and says, "Hey," he said, "aren't you a hydrologist?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, hydrologists don't usually write that way. Would you like to write a book?" And I said, "Yes, I would." And he said, "Well, you should write one with me." And that person was Lucas Church. And so that was 8 years ago, a long time ago. Lucas grabbed me, and ever since then, Lucas has worked closely with me, shepherded me through the process, knowing that I'm completely ignorant about how books work and how they come about, and yeah, really held my hand through that process. So I appreciate that. And then from there, it was just a matter of the hard work of writing the book. But that's how it came to be, and that's why it was this particular book.
Great, fantastic. You dedicate this book to your grandmother. Tell us about her.
Yeah. My grandmother, Martha, really, sorry. First of all, she was an amazing woman. She worked in Washington, D.C. during World War II and would never tell anybody what she did. And so we only found out after she passed away that she was working at a place called Arlington Hall. And these were women code breakers during World War II. And so she had been sworn to secrecy. And true to her word, she never revealed what she did. But one time, I was probably a teenager. I was pressing her, and she leaned in real close and said, "We were making bombs." "So you were making bombs?" And she nodded. After she passed away, I was at a conference, and the NSA was there at a job. It was a job fair, and so National Security Agency had a booth, and they had an Enigma machine from World War II, and you could come up and touch it. And I was chatting with the guy. I said, I think my grandmother had something to do with all this intelligence stuff during World War II, but she told me she was making bombs. And the guy said, "Oh yeah, that's what the ladies called it. They called it a bomb factory because of the machines that they use had this ticking noise, and it sounded like a ticking time bomb." Yeah, so Grandma was an interesting woman, but she really embodied Robeson County to me. Most of my experiences in Robeson County radiated out from her home. So that was our home base in Robeson County. She took care of us. She cooked. She loved us. And yeah, it was wonderful and really special. And I couldn't think of another person who embodied the place that we come from as much as my grandmother.
Great. You refer to these as a collection of stories through your personal lens. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, so I talk about my lens in terms of sort of two different facets. On one hand, I'm a hydrologist, and you and I have spent many years talking about and working on and being in the field together doing hydrology, and you and I have very similar backgrounds in that respect. And so one of my lenses is the lens of being trained through this Western scientific discipline. And many of the folks out there are in these same disciplines of the environmental sciences. And we have a very particular way that we learn to look at and examine and scrutinize the world. We're taught how to ask questions, how to break things into small chunks and to reduce complex problems into simple, achievable objectives and questions that we can answer on the time scale of student degrees. But there's another facet to that lens as well, and it's as a Lumbee person, it's hard to separate, you know, the river from the wetlands, from the fields and the farms. There's an integrated perspective that is very wide spatially, but it's also very deep temporally. So it's also hard to separate my experiences from my parents' experiences and my grandparents' experiences. So there are sort of two sides to the way that I examine that. And I know that we want to talk about that a little bit later, but that's really what I mean when I talk about the lens that I use to look at the world of this book.
There are a couple of instances in the book that I want to highlight here for everyone. You first write that in 2014, the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs invited you to join the newly formed Committee on Environmental Justice. And sometime later, you found yourself on Capitol Hill at an invitation of a federally funded agency to provide your expertise at a congressional hearing, your expertise on water security in the United States. To me, these two moments seem to be critical moments for you in your professional path, but also in your personal journey. Tell us how these events influence you and your work.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I would agree with you. Both of those events were pivotal in, I would say, both my professional and my personal journey. And I think both of them come out a little bit in the book. So in 2014, the Commission of Indian Affairs, which is a body of the state government that's housed within the Department of Administration and represents tribal communities and urban native organizations to state government and helps to set policies and inform state actions related to tribes. They decided they were going to form an environmental justice committee. And so I got a call and said, would you like to be on this brand new committee? And I said, yes. And then I thought about it for a little bit and I said, what's environmental justice? So I guess I was following the first rule of improv. I said yes, and but it, yeah. So really, I thought if I'm going to take this seriously, I've got to learn what this is all about. And, you know, one of my skills is an educator and a teacher. And I thought, well, maybe we can all learn about this together. And this can be an educational opportunity for all of us, everyone on the committee. And so really for me, it was an opportunity to become a student again, to dig deep into the academic literature on environmental justice that goes back decades, but also learn about environmental justice policy. So doing both of those things at the same time. And also figuring out ways to make it relevant to the tribal communities who are represented by the people on the Commission of Indian Affairs that I worked with. And so doing those two things or three things all at once oriented me to this mindset of thinking about environmental justice from the perspective of North Carolina tribes, thinking about the unique challenges that we face politically, environmentally, socially, and trying to articulate that in a way that that our tribal leaders and community members could understand and grasp onto and make relevant to their lives. The congressional briefing in 2016 was also a turning point in its own way. I had been invited in the summer of 2016 to be part of a briefing on water security. And my role was to represent the work of academic hydrologists in informing big numerical models of stream flow and groundwater and all of the things that we need to make predictions about droughts and floods and things like this. So I was there to speak on behalf of academics and say how our research gets translated into these operational models. And we spent weeks fine tuning our talks. There was no 15 slides and winging it. This was scripted down to the second. And, I've got 4.5 minutes to do this much and 2.5 to do something else. And then I have to pass it off to the next person because, you're only there for an hour and you have to cover the entire topic of water security for people who are probably going to 10 briefings that day on all kinds of security and issues like this, right? So very limited amount of time. 2 weeks before the hearing, I watched online as the private security firm sicked their dogs onto water protectors at Standing Rock. And that had a big impact on me. And I thought, gosh, I've been given this privilege and platform to go to DC to talk about water, and all of this is happening in the Great Plains. And I felt a moral obligation to talk to the organizers and see if there was some way to incorporate this material into the talk. And everybody agreed that I was throwing a wrench into the works by messing up our finely tuned script. But to their credit, everybody also agreed that, yeah, this is a critically important topic that we needed to broach. And so we manipulated that finely tuned schedule, and I consulted with folks who had been on the ground there. I consulted with leaders from the Lumbee tribe who had sent emissaries recently to Standing Rock to be with the water protectors there. And folks also thought that it was a good idea to bring this up in the briefing. And so it was at that point that I think I really made the connection that, as an academic who works at a large research institution, I actually do have a platform, and I should use it for things that I think are important. And one of those things was and is amplifying perspectives of water protectors, Indigenous peoples more generally, and other people who experience these types of injustices. And so that was an eye-opening moment for me. And I think it really changed the way that I think about my responsibilities as an academic, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. Speaking of injustices, you provide examples of resistance and healing, moving examples of both. You describe efforts by tribal members and governments to raise awareness regarding the Atlantic Coast Pipeline.
Yeah.
You describe efforts of this tribal governments to provide outreach, extensive outreach. And you also describe challenges and accomplishments by the Coharie people as stewards, protectors, and healers of the great Coharie River. Is your book a tribute to them and their efforts, to all of them and their efforts?
In a way, it is. I thought it was important to highlight these examples of resistance to injustice, of people coming up with strategies to advance their own priorities in the face of these really great challenges, right? And so I also felt that I had a great responsibility to to tell these stories in a way that was respectful, that acknowledged that, of course, all of these issues are complicated and there are multiple perspectives. And I want to be respectful of that as well. Yeah, but I really think that you could see it as a tribute to all of these wonderful acts of stewardship, resistance, healing. Yes, yes, especially to my friends at the Coheri tribe, Greg Jacobs and Philip Bell, just amazing, wonderful examples of stewardship and action and cultural healing and action.
So from the very beginning, your work showed the impact of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and that this impact was going to have a disproportionate effect on people of color. Tell us when you first came to realize this.
Yeah, I realized this when federal regulators released a draft environmental impact statement for this pipeline in late 2016 and early 2017. This is a massive document, hundreds of pages in the main document and thousands of pages of appendices. But thankfully, it's organized in a way that you can flip right to the environmental justice chapter. And so I scanned through it and looked at the demographic analysis and said, this looks kind of fishy. And then I went back to the cover page and I saw a map of the pipeline route. And I said, wow, no wonder this cuts right through Meherrin, Haliwasaponi, Coheri, and Lumbee territories. And so I look at the summary conclusions and the summary conclusions say there are no environmental justice issues of concern with this project. And so that was, I guess that was the moment that I first realized something was off. The next thing I did was I went next door to the office of Louis Rivers, who is a colleague of mine at NC State and is now over at the EPA. I knocked on Louis' door like I did so many times during those years while I was learning about environmental justice. And I said, Louis, can you help me with this? Here are census data. This is the way they're organized. This is the way they've been analyzed and averaged. And Louis confirmed my suspicions. He said, yeah, this is not very good. And so after consulting with a social scientist who deals with these types of analyses, and after looking at the map myself, I realized that something was off. And so as a quantitative scientist, I was more than happy to run the numbers. And those of you who have heard me talk for years have heard me go on and on about weighted averages and demographic disparities. And it's really a simple middle school problem. And so I was more than happy to redo the math and to share that with everybody that I could.
Great. And speaking of numbers, here's something that I find shocking with regards to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. You write that energy companies had reserved nearly 80% of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline's expected capacity, 80% for their own consumption. Wow.
Yeah, wow. And so this project was marketed as a way to transform the economy of Eastern North Carolina, but in the end, it was sort of self-serving to the people who were trying to build it. And I talk about in the book that this is not new. It happened in the 1950s as well. When these pipelines were first built, you could look at the headlines from Eastern North Carolina newspapers in 1957, 1958, and you were thinking that looking at headlines from 2015 and 2016 because the headlines were, this pipeline is going to transform the economy of Eastern North Carolina. And so it's the same narrative over and over again, but what it really boils down to, or at least in this case, was sort of a self-serving project where, any benefits were sort of ancillary to the main goal of the project.
Here's something else that I find shocking also with numbers. And I have it here and I'm going to be using this in my class. So you present a very simple and powerful analysis, numbers. this is the comparison of poultry operations and hog operations in 1950 relative to 2017. Okay, so here are some numbers. 1950 poultry operations, 7,000, just above 7,000. In 2017, 114. So the number of poultry operations dropped to 114. Now, the number of animals per operation went from 30 animals to 61,000 animals per operation. And the same thing happens with hogs. In 1950, about just shy of 7,000 operations. In 2017, 32 operations. A big drop in the number of operations, but the number of animals per operation go from 6 animals to 10,000, over 10,000 animals per operation. So this goes counter to that idea that these remain small farms. These are not small farms today.
No, they're not. I mean, they're industrial operations, and you know, we can acknowledge them as such without without calling them small family farms. I think that's yeah.
Yeah.
But I remember growing up in Robeson County, seeing those numbers make sense. You know, 6 hogs and 30 chickens. I mean, that's what everybody had. You had a few hogs down in a pen by the woods, and the chickens roamed all around the yard.
Yep.
And that was a farm. So it's a far cry from, you know, the operations that we have today.
Right. So your book is very factual, but also very personal, and I truly enjoyed reading it. You write that the Lumbee River was largely absent from maps created during the colonial period. You write that when, and I'm quoting here, when I travel to these places, I speak their names out loud. Tell us why.
We don't have a lot of our language. In fact, we've lost almost all of our language. But one of the things that we haven't lost are these names. And so I kind of feel like they want to hear their proper names spoken. And so when I cross these rivers, or when I paddle, or when I see them, I like to say their names. And it just makes me feel good.
Right. You provide a series of recommendations to tribal nations. You write that the work of restoring justice to the coastal plain and its people begins with us. Tell us about these recommendations, and tell us about what you hope they can achieve.
Yeah, you know, I end with recommendations for lots of different groups of people. But I really do think that, you know, if not Indigenous peoples, then who? You know, these are our ancestral lands. We come from these places. We're always going to be here, and so I think it's our responsibility to take the lead and to bring as many people along with us as we can, because these are our shared homelands. Everybody in this room, you know, we all come from somewhere. We all call someplace home. You know, right now, this moment, we're all in North Carolina, and we're sharing this space, and we've got to figure out a way to work together as stewards. But I really feel like it's our responsibility to lead the way. And I hope that we can lead the way with the types of ideas that are rooted in our values and our experiences as Indigenous people, as Lumbee people, or Coharie people, because I think that will provide some solutions that are fundamentally different from the kinds of strategies that got us into this mess. Extraction, colonialism. I think if we envision this place, the land and the water, as a relative that needs to be cared for and that cares for us, it will fundamentally alter the way that we interact with our lands and waters. I don't know what that will look like. I have no idea, but I think that that's a good place to start imagining. And I really look forward to seeing the fruits of that imagination.
So this is my last question before we move on to Q&A, but throughout the book, you often offer your perspective as a hydrologist, followed sometimes in the next paragraph by your perspective as a Lumbee person. And I think many of us can make similar connections to our own lives, right? We write and we think of those connections that we make to our professional lives, something that we write and our colleague is going to read. But the second perspective, the personal perspective, is often the unspoken one. So it's what's going on inside. We can be sharing the same space, looking at the same phenomena, and but we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
You do that very effectively here in the book. And I wanted to know, why did you want to draw out these dual perspectives throughout the book?
There were a lot of reasons, but I think the one that I want to try and explain now is that I wanted to offer it as a model for how we can think about these kinds of problems. I referenced Western academic institutions earlier, and we're taught to separate ourselves from the questions that we ask and the problems that we study, and that doesn't sit well with me. And so I use this book as a way to figure that out for myself. What does it look like to embrace the human side of these questions, and not just, I don't mean the social science side, I mean the emotional side of these topics and these issues that we work on. And you're absolutely right. Like, we all bring a perspective to our work, whether we acknowledge it or not. And we usually do leave it implicit in the papers that we write, in the conversations that we have. And I think it's a good thing to bring it to the surface. Let's acknowledge it ourselves. In some cases, it can help us see biases that we might have, but it can also lead to new and interesting and innovative kinds of work. And so I hope that this can encourage other people to embrace both sides of their identities, their professions, or whatever.
Yeah, great. All right. Thank you, Ryan. I really enjoy your book and I learned a lot.
Thanks, Diego. Yeah, I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, we have time for questions. So we will ask, because we do have many people online who would like to hear the questions. So we'll ask that you speak into the microphone. So.
We have one guy.
Hey, Ryan, good to see you.
Hey, Will.
My name is Will Freund, from here working at UNC-Chapel Hill. But I'm going to ask you a qualitative question. I'm sorry you're a quantitative scientist, but I'm going to ask you a qualitative question. Connection to land, I think, is super important. I'm really excited to read the book and kind of learn about your perspective on connection to land. So thinking about that, connection to land is a really important way for us to learn about how to care about the land that we are on and the land that we are visiting. So I'm just going to ask a really simple question: what is your favorite smell or sound when you're out on the swamp?
You said smell or sound?
Or sound. I'll give you the option, but it has to be qualitative.
Thank you. I'm zooming in on a sound, and I think it's the sound of the river when you have tree branches trailing in the water. And if you're really quiet, you can hear the water as it passes through those leaves. It's not quite a ripple and it's not quite a tinkle. And you can only hear it when you're still and when you're quiet. So like when you're floating past in a boat. You can just barely hear the sound of those leaves as they rustle on the surface of the water. That's a wonderful question. Thanks for that, Will. Yes. Oh, down here in the front.
Yeah, so Ryan, within many of the experiences I've had growing up in Washington, D.C. and here in North Carolina, and this probably exists, I'm sure it does across the country, there are river keepers, you know, have these formal traditions. And I was just wondering if indeed there are similar practices or individuals within the Kohari or Lumbee Nation. And so that first and foremost, but then what do you see as the challenges to these rivers above and beyond the Atlantic pipeline?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. So, you know, we do have some formal river keepers that are affiliated with that institution in our communities. And, you know, the one that comes to mind is Jefferson Curry, the Lumbee River Keeper, who was trying to get here this evening and texted me to say that he had been stalled by storms on his way here from Alabama. But yeah, so we have a wonderful example of a professional river keeper who is Lumbee and who stewards the Lumbee River. I want to lift up my Kohari brothers and sisters and just highlight their example of stewardship that's not based on their affiliation with an organization. It's simply based on their desire to make sure that their children and grandchildren can continue to have tangible experiences with the river the way that their parents and grandparents have. And so for them, it means things like making sure that the river is accessible to everybody. Can you actually get down to the water to put your feet in it? What if you're an elder or someone with limited mobility? Can you get to the water? That's a priority. And they have worked really hard to make sure that they have access points along the river, you know, that everyone can use to be near the water. And they've also manifested that as an ecotourism enterprise, so that they can share their passion for the river with everybody. You know, having said that, I outline a number of challenges to these rivers in the book, you know, besides fossil fuel infrastructure. You know, we do have issues with pollution from industrial livestock operations. You know, that's a huge challenge in many of our communities in Eastern North Carolina. These are water quality challenges. These are issues that affect the health of aquatic ecosystems, and also of the people who interact with those waters. Climate change is another huge threat that I talk about in the book. You know, we're looking at a more extreme climate in the future, worse droughts and worse floods, and that's a really difficult situation to live in, especially when it's hard to predict those extremes. And so that's a way that we're going to have to learn to live and to interact with these rivers, because you know, there's such a long lag time with climate change that, you know, even if we were to solve the greenhouse gas issue today, we would still have to live with these changes for decades, if not centuries, to come. And so the rivers are, as much as we love them in a way, they're becoming more dangerous to us and to our non-human relatives. Yeah.
Hi, Ryan. My name's Erin Locklear. I grew up in Robeson County fishing the river there. And just wanted to quickly say, you got me talking about your grandma. Just wanted to quickly say thanks for your book. I live in Durham now, even though my family is still in Fairmont. And when I have read the nuggets, it's like nuggets of home, which is one of the highest compliments I could give. So thank you for that. And I did have a question. And this, you posted your cover before I ever got the book. So I saw your cover before I actually got the book. And this question came to mind just seeing your cover and seeing the title, which I got immediately and appreciate that. I sort of living here in Durham and going back home frequently, that sometimes feels like a journey. And certainly as I've been further away has felt like more of a journey in some ways. And I wondered about this duality of feeling because the title of your book, On the Swamp, makes me think about times I'm not on the swamp. And I wondered if it did the same for you. I know that you've spent, although your home base is there and you're back a lot, you're not always there. And I wondered if that perspective, or I wonder if you could speak to the value or not value, or how you feel about that perspective of not on the swamp and on the swamp.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much. And I had to, that's I received that compliment as yeah, that means a lot to me. Thank you. That's complicated, right? Because I don't want to say a foot in both worlds, because I think that's a well-trodden metaphor, but really you're an insider and you're an outsider at the same time. And that's a hard space to live in. You know, I love my family in Robeson County and they love me, but at the same time, I'm not there every day. And it affects my relationships to people and to places. And so, you know, especially here in North Carolina, there are a lot of Lumbees who live away from home, and we share that experience. And I don't know, it's not better or worse, but it's different. It gives you a different perspective on what it means to be at home, and you long for home more than you get to experience it firsthand. And so it's a challenging place to be, but it really makes me appreciate the opportunities that I do have to go home. And I'm also glad that I'm not that far away, right? Because we've got people all over the country and they only come home once a year, if that. And so I'm super privileged in that respect. Yes, Norman. And while Norman's getting the mic, I want to say you said you fished. I don't fish. My mom took me fishing when I was a preschooler, and I said, "Mom, when are we leaving?" And she said, "When these worms are all done." And I picked up the couple worms and I dumped them in the river. And we were done, but I also got.
I don't know how I can ask a question after that. So Ryan, thank you so much for this book and for sharing yourself in the book. And the question that I have relates to this term that you started using more toward the end of your remarks, which was the term relative. And it seems to me that for a lot of people, that language is really foreign when thinking about rivers or more than human creatures. And I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about how you have seen people transform so they start thinking about their places as a place where relatives reside? Is there something that you can say about how we help each other move more in that direction rather than this sort of commodification, objectification way that we have of talking about our places and fellow creatures?
Yeah, you know, I think it is as simple, for example, as the language that we use. You know, when we talk about our non-human relatives, it puts us in a different space than when we talk about natural resources, right? Which is a term that I'm very uncomfortable with, even though I spent more than a decade in a college of natural resources, right? But you know, to look at a tree and call it a natural resource versus to call it a relative, I think it puts you in a completely different headspace, and it makes you receptive to ideas that you have a relationship, you know, to a non-human entity. and what are the responsibilities that come with that relationship. And so I think it can affect what we think of when we think of terms like stewardship, for example. How do we bring people along with us besides being intentional in our language? I think we have to start modeling it in our actions. You know, in Robeson County, that looks like being intentional about our time on the water and being deliberate about it and making sure that we actually make time to go on the river, just like we have to make time to visit and spend time with the people that we love. We need to be intentional about spending time in the places that we love. Thanks. Yeah, Justin.
Ryan, thanks so much. This has been wonderful. You mentioned something when you were talking about your Coheri friends about wanting the river, the experience of the children and the grandchildren to be the same as the experience of the parents and the grandparents, and you talked about a deep time perspective. At the same time, these are landscapes, in this case, literally fluid, but always changing. And I'm wondering how that deep time perspective also incorporates a constant state of change, because I think there's a risk of having a static preservationist attitude, which I think is foreign to the nature of these relatives of ours.
Yeah, thanks for that. So a couple of things. We know that that change is the norm, but the envelope of change matters. And the envelope that we experience today is very different than than we've experienced in many generations since time immemorial, right? So that's a major concern. Like, we're totally prepared to change with changing environments and changing climates, but just like the ghost forests, we need that rate of change to stay within certain bounds. And so it's a major disruption when we start to exceed those bounds. The other thing that I think is amazing and encouraging is that, you know, the fact that Lumbee people and Coheri people and Hawawasaponi are still here means that they're really good at adapting to change, right? And so we survive by adapting. And I fully embrace the idea that, you know, we can adapt to change. We have to adapt to change. And, you know, my descendants are gonna have a Robeson County that's very different from the one that I experienced. And I don't know if I've come to grips with that yet, but I know that that's coming. I know that that's reality. But I also know that they have the ability to adapt to it and maintain their identities and maintain their cultures and do it in ways that I can't even imagine. But yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that.
So Ryan, I just had a question more about your own decision making. I know that you're a yes man in the sense that you say yes to a lot of projects, and we have been the beneficiaries of that all across the state and really across the nation. So thank you for saying yes. But as you are a wanted man and more requests are made of you, more demands are made of you, I'm curious about your discernment process where you are now in when you say yes, and if there's any times when you kind of wish you had said no, how you've gained perspective on balancing that, being at the swamp, being away from the swamp, being a teacher, being an advocate, being a dad and a husband and family person too. So
Thanks
any
for that,
thoughts
Emily.
on that?
Yeah, it's tough. And I try to be transparent with my lab group and others that, like, I don't do a good job of it. I don't know how to balance, because I like to say yes to all of these wonderful things. I like to say yes so much that I actually have a no committee, and the chair of my no committee is here tonight. Thanks, Emily. And so the no committee only gives one answer, but I need that, right? And so that's one of the ways that I try to get balance and accountability, because I want to be around for a long time and have opportunities to say yes to things in the future. So yeah, I really appreciate that, but it's hard and I don't have it figured out. So I don't want to pretend that I do.
This is not to tell you to say no. So happy to see this book and this effort come to this beautiful fruition, Ryan. I'm curious, as you've embraced this other side of yourself and this other lens, how's it changing the way you teach and mentor? What should we learn from you in environmental science teaching?
Thanks for that, Emily. So yesterday I was sitting with some of our master's students. No, not, I'm sorry. Tuesday I was sitting with some of our master's students and someone asked me what my, what is the personality test called?
MBTI.
Yeah, the Myers-Briggs. They said, what's your Myers-Briggs? And I said, oh yeah, I did that 15 years ago. So I spouted out my combination. And the student said, you know, my superpower is intuiting people's Myers-Briggs categories. She said, you said you were a T, a thinker. She said, but she said, I thought you were F, a feeler. And I said, huh. I said, well, you know, it was a long time ago that I took that test. And I think that my thinking as a scholar and my teaching as a professor now benefit from a focus on how we feel about the things that we work on and not just getting a calculation right. I mean, that's really important. I'm a numbers person. And I like to see calculations done right, but embracing the way that you feel about the larger issue is super important. And I want my students to be able to pull that into their own work, whatever they do, you know, whether it's academia or whether it's in other professions. I really want them to feel comfortable about you know, bringing the way they feel into their work. Thanks.
Well, and that's all the time we have for formal questions, but there will be lots of lingering time. We have reception out here. Give me a minute to uncover things. But thank you very much to both of you. I'm glad you didn't say no to writing the book. I'm glad you said yes to having a book launch event. And thanks to everybody who came. This is just an extraordinary feeling to be in the space with you all. So thanks very much.